Good morning, afternoon, and hello. I'd like to welcome everybody to our webinar, Nonprofit Funding Trends for 2019. My name is Max Smith. I'm the Communications Director with 501c Services. For those of you who are not already partnering with us, we are a 100% employee-owned company that provides alternatives to state-run unemployment insurance programs. We provide services to more than 1,500 nonprofits nationally. Our business model, we operate the 501c Agencies Trust, which offers a comprehensive suite of risk management services and multiple stop-loss protection solutions for 501c3 nonprofits. We also operate UInsure, which is a first dollar unemployment insurance program, not only for nonprofits, but government entities and tribally owned businesses as well. As I said earlier, many of you are already working with us, and we appreciate you doing so and look forward to working with you in the future. I have a few items, and then I'll turn the program over to our speaker, to David King. David's going to take questions as we go. So if you have any questions that come up, if he's talking about puppies and you have a puppies question, go ahead and shoot it to us, and he'll address that before he moves on to the next subject. The materials, we will email those to you later today, but they're also already uploaded in the GoToWebinar browser there under Handouts. So you can download his slides now and take notes if you'd like. I will also send you a recording of today's program as well later today, about an hour after we're done. We have CAE credits for those of you who need those today. Just complete the post-event survey for me. Let me know you need them, and I will email them on over to you. And also, we have one more webcast later this month, or later this year. It's our annual Nonprofit HR Legal and Accounting Trends. We'll do that on December 11th at 12 p.m. Eastern. So I'll send you all a link to that as well, so you can go ahead and sign up for that, our last one of the year. Finally, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker today, Mr. David King. He's the president and CEO of Alexander Haas. He has over 30 years of work with hundreds of organizations in the nonprofit arena, higher education, healthcare, human services, as well as many faith-based organizations. He knows a bit about fundraising, and he's going to look into his crystal ball for you all today and let you know what he sees for next year. David, good morning.
Good morning. Welcome, everyone. The puppy questions need to be very simple because that is not my area of expertise. But the fundraising questions I can handle. We wanted to talk to you some today. We're going to talk about some things that some of these trends are things that started in 2018 or even beyond, and that we see expanding or growing as we move into 2019. And then some of these things will be, as we're looking at what we see going on with hundreds of clients all across the country involved in fundraising, some things that we see happening in the sector that we think are going to lead to other trends coming next year. To get these on your radar screen, some of them are things that you need to do some preparation to be ready for as they come down the pike. So please do ask questions as we go. That way, we'll stay on the slide where we ask the questions, but hopefully there'll be a little time at the end for more questions or general questions if we need them. So I want to start talking a little bit about donor-advised funds and what's going on with donor-advised funds. Just over the last 5 years, we've more than doubled the number of donor-advised funds operating in the United States. And we see that trend continuing, really expanding pretty dramatically. Part of it is going to be driven by the tax law changes, and we'll talk a little bit more about that down the road. But the change in tax laws, and specifically the increase of the standard deduction and the limiting of some of the itemized deductions, have created a situation where making a significant amount of charitable contributions into a donor-advised fund in 1 year and then spending that down as you give money to charities over the next few years can be a very attractive tax strategy for some people if they don't reach the threshold for itemizing every year. They may make enough contributions in one year into a donor advised fund so that they do reach the itemizing threshold for that year, but to not give all the money back out in that one year. So as that starts to happen, another thing that we think you're going to see is you're going to see a lot more avenues where you can create a donor advised fund. So your options for sources for donor advised funds are going to expand. Right now, you have a couple of choices in that area, really. You have your local community foundations, which are really where the donor advised fund started. And then you have a number of financial institutions, Fidelity and Schwab being the largest two at the moment, who house donor advised funds. And you have several other organizations that are doing it as well. But if we do start to see this explosion in donor advised funds as a result of the tax code, or even if we just continue to see growth at the same rate that we have been seeing it, doubling over the last 5 years, we think that more local banks, more local foundations, and even some nonprofits themselves who have a lot of donors creating donor advised funds may move into the business of housing donor advised funds for organizations. So you're going to see a lot more places where you can go to set up and manage your own donor advised fund. But one of the things that is most definitely going to happen with this, as more money is pouring into donor advised funds and they start to proliferate, is the government is going to want to get more involved. Whenever they see large pots of money going anywhere, they want to figure out how to get their cut of it. There has also been, or there has already been, a good bit of discussion about donor advised funds and whether or not the government should be regulating them in some way. The way that's most often talked about is to require that any money that goes in has to be given back out into the sector within 5 years. And I think there's a lot of support for that kind of thing on the nonprofit side of the equation, because what we all want to see is philanthropic contributions coming into the sector and supporting the work that we all do, not sort of getting tied up indefinitely in donor advised funds. But I think we are going to see the government step in. There is already a requirement that private foundations give away 5% of their assets every year, and I think we're going to see the government impose some requirements on donor advised funds as well as they continue to grow and expand and take in more and more money. Next slide, Mac. So annual giving, and I talked some about how the tax law change was really going to push the donor advised fund, and it's changing annual giving in other ways. Certainly, the growth of the donor advised funds, which we've discussed, and leading people into bundling of gifts. The bundling of gifts is the concept that I don't give away enough money every year, or I don't have enough deductions every year to pass the standard deduction threshold. But periodically, I'm going to bundle my charitable gifts and give them all in 1 year, itemize my tax deductions in that year, and then go back to standard deduction tax filing in the following year. So what has been termed in the industry as bundling. Now, we have actually seen over the last 3 months a number of accounting firms who are sending out advices to their clients, encouraging them to think about bundling for tax purposes. So this is something that is being encouraged by accounting firms of their clients who make philanthropic contributions. But there are other ways to bundle giving beyond putting it in a donor advised fund. So you can bundle your gifts directly to an organization. And if this starts happening, and it is going to happen, it's just a matter of what the scale is going to be. When this starts happening, it potentially creates some challenges for you on the nonprofit side in terms of how you count gifts and how you account for gifts. And so let me give you an example of that when it comes to how you're counting gifts. So let's say you have a donor who is a $1,000 a year donor, and they come to you and say, I don't have enough deductions to itemize every year, but I still want to support you. So this year I'm going to give you $5,000, and I want you to count that $1,000 a year for this year and the next 4 years as my annual contribution, just like I always give it to you. So there you have an issue there, in terms of how you're going to count that in your fundraising totals. So are we going to count that as a $5,000 gift this year and then not report it in our fundraising totals for the next 4 years, even though the donors told us that's sort of their intention, is that it be counted that way? Or are we going to count it, $1,000 a year and report that in our totals? If you end up with large numbers of people who are bundling, you could end up seeing what looks like on the surface sort of a roller coaster ride in your year-over-year fundraising totals, with donors giving every several years significant chunks in and then not in other years, which could make it look like you're having up and down years when really in reality it's a function of tax law and donor behavior and has nothing to do with how effective you're being with your ongoing fundraising. So there's a counting issue there in terms of when we're going to count that money, when we're going to reflect it in our donor counting, and also how we're going to recognize donors. So do you recognize that donor as a $5,000 donor this year, but then recognize them as a $0 donor in the next 4 years, even though that was not their intention? The other way that this counting has an impact, and the counting is really an internal thing here, not a tax filing thing. Obviously, you have to report the money from a 990 perspective in the year that you got the money. But the other way this has an impact is in terms of how we quantify on the fundraising side lapsed donors. So some of you may be familiar with the terms LIBUNT and SIBUNT. LIBUNT meaning last year but not this year donor, and SIBUNT meaning some year but not this year donor. So if we have a donor who's been $1,000 a year donor and they give us $5 this year and they're not going to give us anything for the next 4 years, we have to be careful that we don't let them fall into a lapsed donor pool where we're reaching out to them over and over again over the next years, sort of with a, please come back, we need your support message, even though they have already told us that the support is going to come episodically. And part of the challenge here is on the software vendor side, because most of the software vendors at this point have not programmed into their system a way to really account for these one-time gifts that the donor would like to be counted over multiple calendar years. So it's going to require us to use great care until the software side catches up with donor behavior to make sure that we are not reaching out to a donor and asking them why they've left us when in fact they're still with us. They're just giving their money in a different way. Now on the accounting side, there's another variable here that this creates, which is when the money comes in, when we get the $5,000 in 2018 that we're supposed to count over the next 4 years, are we going to spend that money in the year that we receive it? So all $5,000 goes into a spendable account this year when we get it. Or are we going to put it in some kind of escrow account and pull out $1,000 a year, maybe plus some interest if there is any, and spend it on an annual basis, sort of the way the donor had been giving before and the way the donor thinks they're setting up their giving now? Again, it's going to be different for each organization how they want to approach it. But if you choose to spend it all in the year you get it, you could see cash flow ebbs and flows significantly over from year to year if you have large numbers of donors doing this kind of bundling. And it really has to be factored in when you begin to budget year to year. You can't just look at the revenue. You have to sort of back out the revenue that's not going to be recurring because of the bundling. So those are a couple of things that as an organization you need to be thinking about and be prepared for, so that when you do get that first donor who approaches you and says, here's what I'm planning to do, my accountant has told me I need to bundle my gifts, so that you can explain to them exactly how your organization is going to handle bundled gifts, how they'll be recognized in your donor recognition, how the gift will be counted, when the gift will be used, when you'll come back to them for another request for a contribution. But really so that you know what your organization's rules are going to be from the outset, and that you can communicate those rules to your donors when they're making the gifts and not after the fact. Next slide. Number of donors continues to decline. So I'm not sure how aware you may be of this, but the number of, even though according to Giving USA last year, we reached an all-time high with over $410 billion in donations to nonprofits, the number of people contributing has actually been declining for quite a while, and it's declining at a rate of about 1% fewer donors per year. So more money coming from fewer people. We're also seeing this particularly in higher education with alumni giving down, even though if you follow the education sector, you know that it's the second largest recipient of contributions in any given year, and continues to grow at really rapid rates. I think Harvard just finished a $9 billion capital campaign. But we're seeing this from fewer and fewer donors year over year, and there are a couple of things that are driving this. One of them is that the donors seem to be making a decision to maintain or even increase the amount of money that they are giving, but cutting back on the number of places that they're doing it. So trying to make larger, perhaps more impactful gifts to fewer organizations rather than spreading the money fairly thinly. The other is that we now have the millennials as now the largest living generation of people, and then Generation X thrown in there, both of these groups coming into their sort of philanthropic sweet spots. And all the research on these two generations of donors points to a group that have relatively short attention spans with their philanthropy. So they tend to change the organizations that they're giving to fairly routinely, whereas prior generations would start contributing to a charity and might continue to give to the same charity or group of charities for 20 or 30 years, year over year. We find that there's a lot more what we call churn with the millennials and the Generation X donors, picking charities each year and sometimes with no connection to what they may have done in a prior year, and that's one of the things that leads to the number of donors declining as well. At least when you look at it organization by organization, we see a big increase in that SCI-Bunt and LI-Bunt for organizations. Even though they may be doing a great job with their development programs, there is just a behavioral thing out there that they have no control over. Next slide. Giving to religion continuing to decline. So if you follow Giving USA at all, you know that giving to religion is the largest recipient of contributed dollars year over year, and has been going back to 1956 when Giving USA first started producing these results. But what's hidden in there, and what we've ginned out with this slide that you see here, is that while the dollar amount for giving to religion is still the largest recipient, the percentage of the total that's going into religious organizations is in a pretty rapid decline, which you can see here on this slide, from more than 50% back in the middle 1980s to last year down to 31% after several years flat at 30%. We believe that this trend is going to continue, that we're going to continue to see the market share, if you will, to use a business term, of philanthropy going into religion is going to continue to decline. There are a couple of reasons for this. One is going back to millennials and Generation X. Millennials and Gen X are the least likely to affiliate with a particular denomination or religion. They attend religious worship services less frequency than their predecessors did, and they're generally less involved in organized religious faith. And as a result, you don't see as much of their philanthropy going to religious causes. So as they move to the forefront of our donor pyramid, but they're not supporting religion and they're not engaged in religious causes as much as their predecessors were, we'll continue to see this giving decline. Another piece of it has to do with the way that congregations in particular, and really particularly Christian congregations of every denomination, approach philanthropy and giving. They tend to approach it in a less professionalized manner than just about every other kind of nonprofit organization I can think of. So, for example, if you think about churches in particular, how many churches can you identify that have a full-time, what we in all the other nonprofits would call development officer on the staff? So someone who's responsible for waking up every morning, thinking about how much money the church needs to raise, and then going out and spending their day trying to make that happen. It's the last of the subsectors to really professionalize fundraising. And so while churches have been stuck in a model of trying to raise all of their money over a 8 to 10 week period, typically in the fall, with only volunteer staffing or only volunteer leadership, no staffing to do it, and really not putting a great deal of effort into making their case. The why does it matter? Why should you give to us? What do we do with the money? But more counting on what used to be talked about as sort of the giving through guilt, giving because it was a necessity or a requirement, or feeling that kind of motivation, rather than giving because you understand the impact. So churches really, most of them haven't moved into trying to really establish that case and get donors to understand the impact and what they should do. And they certainly, in most cases, haven't professionalized. At the same time, the number of nonprofits in this country is growing, at a very significant rate. And all of those competitors fundraise 365 days a year. They have one or many professional staff people whose full-time job is to do that. And essentially, if you look at what has happened, if you look at the Giving USA pie and you go back to this mid-1980s number, what you'll see is that it's not that one of the other subsectors, let's say healthcare or education or arts, that one of those has jumped up and taken a big bite out of the market share that was giving to religion. But what you see is sort of a death by 1,000 paper cut scenario, where every one of the subsectors has increased a little bit, and all of them combined have taken away a little more than 20% of the market share for giving to religion. And we don't see this stopping. We see it continuing. The demographics of the giving base tend to point to it, and we do a fair amount of work with churches, and we find that many of them are just opposed to having a staff person whose job is helping to raise the money to fulfill the budget, and they'd rather cut expenses than professionalize fundraising. And so we believe this trend is going to continue. There doesn't seem to be anything on the horizon that would indicate that the percentage would start to go back up. Next slide. Cryptocurrency. Everybody has heard of Bitcoin. There are several other kinds of cryptocurrency, but cryptocurrency donations are on the rise, and they're going to continue to increase as more and more people adopt cryptocurrency. In 2016, Fidelity had deposits of $7 million in cryptocurrency. In 2017, they saw that increase to deposits of $69.5 million in cryptocurrency. So massive explosion in the number of people buying and storing cryptocurrency just at Fidelity. There was a significant cryptocurrency event that happened this past year, where on the Ellen DeGeneres show, Ashton Kutcher went on and made a $2 million contribution to her charity, did it with his cell phone in cryptocurrency. It happened on live TV. It took about 10 seconds for the transaction to complete, and really cast a lot of spotlight on the fact that contributing with cryptocurrency was very easy and very safe. For people who have been in the cryptocurrency game for a while, it's also a highly appreciated asset. And the way that the IRS treats cryptocurrency is essentially the same way that they treat gifts of stocks or other securities. So, cryptocurrency has a value. Like any stock you might have in your portfolio, that value can change minute to minute throughout the day, except that it changes on a 24-hour cycle, not an 8-hour trading cycle like the U.S. stock markets. And for many people who bought cryptocurrency early in its infancy, it has now appreciated significantly. So it is a very attractive charitable giving tool because it's a highly appreciated asset. So as we start to see this expansion in cryptocurrency as a philanthropic tool, as an organization, one of the things you need to do is be prepared should someone approach you with a gift of cryptocurrency. How are you going to handle it? The first question you need to ask yourselves is, are we going to accept cryptocurrency at all? Just like you might have a policy about whether you accept used cars or real estate or anything else. Are we going to take this kind of asset? If you decide that you are going to accept this kind of asset, the next thing you need to do is you need to find a resource for you to store it and convert it to cash. And you need to have a policy. You may have a policy that anytime you receive a gift of securities, you immediately sell it and convert it to cash. You need a similar policy to describe how you're going to handle gifts of cryptocurrency because they are an asset just like a stock. Are you going to hold on to it, or is your policy to sell it immediately? And how are you going to accomplish that? You've got to have a crypto wallet somewhere. Your local bank might have it, or they might not. You might need to open that with another institution like Fidelity or some other. But you've got to have a place where you can store it and somebody who can, whenever you want to, whether it's immediately or down the road, someone who can convert it to cash so that you can get out there and spend it. So those are things that you need to be thinking about when it comes to cryptocurrency. You need to educate, make sure that your staff who handle gift processing are educated in how the IRS wants cryptocurrency treated. They want it valued in the exact same way that they ask us to value stocks. So they want you to look at the high and the low trading level for the day and take the average, and that's the value. They want it to be reported back to donors in the same way that we handle any other asset like that has a market, a readily made market for it. So to be aware of that and to, determine how and if your fundraising software, your donor software, can even account for a gift of cryptocurrency, or if you're going to need to convert that to a cash number and store it in that way. But these are questions that you want to have. You want to have policies written, board adopted, so that when you are approached with a gift of cryptocurrency, like we talked before when we were talking about bundling, so that when you are approached with that first gift of cryptocurrency, you're prepared to talk with the donor about how you deal with it, how you handle it, what you're going to do with it, if you're going to hold it or liquidate it, and that you can make sure that the donor understands how you value that, because they may think of it as the same as cash. And in many ways, in terms of practical day-to-day uses of it, cryptocurrency is the same as cash. You can go out to places that accept it and you can buy stuff with cryptocurrency. But from an IRS perspective, it's not cash, it's not dollars, it's an appreciated asset that has to be dealt with differently than cash. So just be prepared with your policies and be prepared to educate donors about that. Next slide. The next issue we'll get into is the issue of ticketing and the value of tickets. So a little bit of history here. Up until January 1st of this year, going back to the 1980s, if you made a contribution to a college or university athletic program, and as a benefit of that contribution, you were given the right to buy sporting event tickets, maybe better tickets than somebody who didn't give, maybe buy them earlier than somebody who didn't give, that you were allowed to deduct 80% of that contribution as a charitable contribution from your tax return, but the other 20% was considered non-deductible. It was considered to be the value of the benefit of that access to tickets. With the tax law change that started in January of this year, those gifts are no longer tax deductible at all. So gifts to athletics programs that come with access to tickets, even if you don't buy the tickets, but you had the option to do so, those gifts are no longer tax deductible at all. So for the most part, at this point, as we get here into the third quarter of the year, most of the colleges and universities have already dealt with that. They figured out how they're going to handle gifts to athletics. They figured out how they're going to handle their ticketing system, and they've worked it all out. But where the challenge comes in this is there are other types of organizations outside of athletics who also ticket things. And in many cases, when you get your tickets or how you get your tickets or where you get your tickets is connected to how much you contribute. So think about, we'll talk about maybe a museum that has special shows that come in from time to time, and where major donors will be invited to come to an opening of the show, or will be given a certain number of free tickets to come see the show and bring friends. The issue that's being raised by some on the education side is that scenario doesn't really differ in many ways from the athletic ticketing. It's still a ticket to a function. It's connected to how much the donor contributed. It's a ticket that someone who didn't make a contribution would not be able to access, or would not be able to access as good a ticket, or access the ticket as early as that donor. And they're looking around at museums and zoos and performing arts organizations, and starting to ask the question, why are we singled out because our program, because our performance, is an athletic performance, but these other types of nonprofits are not singled out for their performances, whether it be, an exhibition of art, or a performance by a symphony or a ballet, or a ticket to the zoo or the aquarium. Why are we being treated differently? So we think that crescendo is going to continue to build next year, in particular, because next year is the year when, for the most part, athletic donors are going to realize what the true cost of their tickets has become. So let's say that for a $5,000 contribution to good old university, that I get the ability to buy 5 50-yard line football tickets, and the cost of the ticket package for the season is $500 each. So I make my $5,000 contribution. 80% of that previously was tax deductible, so I get to deduct $4,000 of that as a tax return, and then I buy my tickets. I paid $2,000. So the real cost to me was $3,000 for 4 season tickets for this football game, and then I got my tax deduction on the other. Well, under the new scenario, and I don't think a lot of donors have figured this out yet until they go to do their taxes at the end of this year. If I give that $5,000 to the booster club, I get to buy my 4 tickets for $500, so there's my $2,000, but none of that is deductible. So the price of my tickets just went from $3,000 to $7,000 for football tickets. And I think donors are going to begin to realize how expensive those tickets have become, and push back on on colleges and universities. That's where the pain's being felt. And that the colleges and universities are going to begin to rally more loudly that they are being treated unfairly relative to every other kind of organization that has functions and distributes tickets. And when that starts to happen, you have really 3 options here of where that could go. One would be that, and I think this is the least likely, one would be that the government says, oh, you're right, we were wrong. From now on, those contributions to athletics are fully tax deductible. I don't think we're going there. The other option would be that the government says, well, it's really different because college athletics is a big time business, and it's not the same as your local art museum or your local symphony, and it does need to be treated differently, and we're going to leave the status quo as the status quo. But the other thing that could happen would be that the government looks at it and says, you know what, you're right, you are being treated unfairly. We need to treat everybody the same, so we're now going to make contributions to any nonprofit that come with the ability to access tickets to anything non-deductible. I think that is that and the status quo, I think, are the two most likely outcomes. But there is going to be some lobbying on the college and university side for fairness in the process. And I think there's a very real probability or possibility that fairness comes in the form of, if you give anybody tickets for anything, then that invalidates the charitable deductibility of their contribution. It's something to keep an eye on as we get into the new year, as we begin to see donors realize that their gifts aren't tax deductible anymore. The repeal of the 80/20 rule was one line in the entire tax code document that essentially just got crossed out. There was not a big deal made about it outside of college athletics programs. You didn't see it, it wasn't talked about on the news. You haven't really seen much about it even in the Chronicle of Philanthropy or the Chronicle of Higher Education. It was something that really was a big deal in athletic departments, but otherwise was not a lot was made about it. And because of that, I think a lot of donors to those programs aren't aware and will only become aware when they sit down with their accountant here in the next 6 months that contribution they made this year to access those tickets is no longer a tax deductible contribution. And that may change their donative behavior in the coming year, which will drive the colleges and universities to start their cry for a little more fairness. Next slide. The next thing I want to talk about is what's happening, sort of the demise, I guess, of the home telephone and how that impacts philanthropy. Telephone fundraising has been a real staple in the nonprofit sector for decades. It's especially pervasive in higher education fundraising. Anybody who graduated from just about any college in America has received an annual fund phone call, often from a student caller, sometimes from a paid caller, asking for a contribution back to the university. We've all also probably gotten calls from some other kind of organization, soliciting either off of a blind list or because we've given before. We used to talk about these being, that you'd sit down for dinner and the phone rings and you knew it was a telemarketer or a telesolicitor calling. But it really has been a great tool for annual fundraising. It's been a tool that's been used for donor acquisition, and it's been a way for organizations to in a cost-effective way, if done right, to add a personal touch to annual fundraising. So that there's person-to-person, real-time communication as opposed to just sending out letters and brochures and emails and other forms of communication, but to get a personal level of communication. Well, we're at a place now where less than half of homes in the United States have a landline phone anymore. People are moving to cell phone-only households. This is pervasive in the millennial generation. Many of them have never had their own home phone line. They have a cell phone. They've had the same phone number since they were 12 years old. Everybody knows what it is, and they don't say any. Why would you have a phone in your house that has to be plugged into something? It makes no sense to them. But we're also seeing it. We're seeing it in other generations too, as people realize that they're not using their landline phone, that it's, that everyone has their cell phone number and that's where they're getting their calls, that texting is more pervasive. And and that they just don't, they don't need a landline phone anymore. I think one of the last things, maybe the death nail in landline telephones was when the home alarm companies began to move all of their alarm panels to wireless notification, so that you no longer had to have a home phone in order for your alarm panel to be able to call the police if your house was broken into. A lot of people, including myself, kept a landline phone for longer than we needed it for just that reason, because it was the only way my alarm panel could communicate with the outside world. But the alarm monitoring company that I used 2 years ago actually quit monitoring alarms by landline and will only monitor them by a cell chip. So as we've seen, as that has fallen off, even more people have begun to look at their home phone and say, why do I need this? What does it do? Now, the challenge that creates for nonprofit organizations is that for many clients that we work with, they haven't been collecting cell phone numbers over the years. So they may have a great list with great penetration on landline numbers for the constituents in their database. But they haven't been picking up on the secondary phone numbers. They haven't been picking up on cell phone numbers. And they may not have been picking up on the fact that in any given family, there are going to be multiple cell phone numbers. So they may have mine because I put it on some form, but they may not have my wife's. And she may be the one who's the most engaged with the organization. Or she may be the one, down the road who is the surviving spouse, and that's a phone number they no longer have to make that call. So there's a data problem there in that we haven't been collecting cell phone numbers, and as the cell phone continues to become less and less common in households, it's going to be harder and harder for telefundraising programs. The other challenge that this creates has to do with the tactics of rolling out a telephone fundraising campaign. So traditionally, telethon campaigns have been conducted in the evening between the hours of 5:30 and 9 o'clock. We're calling people on their home phone, and we're doing that when we think they might be at home. Well, now that we're moving into a situation where the majority of people are fielding all of their telephone calls on a cell phone, making those calls between that window, that evening window, is not the most productive, may not be the most productive time to do that. The cell phone is on most people's person all the time. So that call doesn't have to be made when we think we're going to catch them at home having dinner. It can be made right now. It can essentially be made, anytime between, let's say 9 a.m. and 9 p.m. So moving to beginning to think about a different calling schedule and beginning to test, and we have some clients who are doing this now. They're testing their answer rates. Do we get more people to actually pick up the phone and talk to us if we call between 1 o'clock and 3 o'clock in the afternoon, or between 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock in the morning, or between 6 o'clock and 9 o'clock at night? When are people answering the phone? So we're going to see a shift there where you won't just get your telephone solicitation phone calls coming in, to your home phone in the evening, but they'll be coming in to your cell phone, and they'll be coming in at all hours of the day when the organization thinks you're most likely to be home. So if you're an organization and you do any significant amount of telephone fundraising, you need to factor into your strategies this decline in the use of home landline phones. And you need to have a couple of strategies in place to deal with it. One is, how do we go about making sure we have cell phone numbers for all of our constituents? Because even if they have a home phone still, they probably also have a cell phone, and that's probably the best way to reach them. So if we haven't been collecting those, how do we go about getting them and appending them to our donor records so that we can still have a productive telephone fundraising campaign? Another aspect of it is, how do we staff a telephone fundraising campaign? If you're at a university where telephone fundraising is really common, the most common way to staff it is with student workers, typically in the evening. So you bring in, a group of 20 students, and you pay them $8 an hour, and you feed them some pizza, and you give them a stack of cards, and they call donors and ask them to renew their gift for next year and thank them for their prior gift, and try to make those calls. And that works on college campuses in the evening. But does it work on college campuses between 1 and 3 in the afternoon? Can you get the pool of workers that you need? Can you get them from 9 o'clock till 10 o'clock in the morning if that's your most productive phone calling time? Those are issues that are going to have to be addressed, in terms of how do we staff these as we move toward a more ubiquitous calling schedule where the evenings maybe is not the most productive time to make those phone calls that they need to be done at other times. Do we have the staff in place to be able to handle making that many phone calls? So those are issues that need to be worked out as you think through how we continue to have a productive telephone fundraising program in a world where everybody is not sitting at home in the evening waiting for us to call and solicit their gift, but we may need to reach them, at a different time of the day and in a different way. And the impact of this has already been significantly altered by caller ID. So most landlines, or people with landlines, have some form of caller ID if they have a phone with a digital display, but every cell phone has it. So what you find is as you move to more solicitation on people's cell phones, that your reach rate declines dramatically because they have caller ID and they can see who's calling. So you have to be thoughtful about what your caller ID readout is going to say when people see that call come across, and be aware that if it used to take you 5 calls to reach somebody on their home phone, that it may take 15 attempts to reach them on a cell phone, or that they may block you. All of these things are changes in how telephone fundraising can work, on how effective it can be, that are a direct result of the fact that we're seeing a real significant decline in the number of landline home telephones and their usage. Next slide. So that is our trends. We have a few minutes left, and I would be happy to answer questions that anybody might have. We can move back to other slides, or if you have something that you see as an emerging trend that you'd like to ask about, I'm happy to do that too. And of course, as Max said, I can attempt to answer questions about puppies.
We did have one question slip in about the level of giving to religious organizations. You were seeing, you had talked about a decrease about 1% a year. Steve wanted to know if it couldn't be interpreted that perhaps the giving had just been leveling off since the late 90s. Do you hear anything like that maybe it's just leveling off and not decreasing as much anymore?
Are you talking about the number of donors or the giving to religion? The
giving to religion.
The number of donors is what's been going down by 1% a year. The giving to religion, I don't know how many years do I have there. It's been falling at maybe a slower rate than that. Well, my answer to that is, if you look at 2011 through 2016, I thought that giving to religion had sort of bottomed out, and that we were at that 32% level, and that we were likely to stay there, or maybe if we could convince organizations that it was in their best interest to try to I'm going to say get more serious about, but professionalize their fundraising, that we could see that start to trickle back up. I don't think we will ever see it back up at a 50% level, because the demographics of the country and the demographics of churches the lack of affiliation, the decline in membership in your mainline Protestant congregations over the years. I think all of those factors are suppressing it at the same time that it's being suppressed by ineffective fundraising techniques. So I don't think we'll ever see it back at the 50%. It did drop again another 1% last year after being flat for several years. Our prediction here is that we're going to continue to see it decline. I don't think it will in my lifetime, and I'm 52 years old, so I have, 30 or so years, 35, 40 years left maybe to live. I don't think we'll see it fall out of its position as the largest recipient, because the next largest recipient behind it is giving to education, and that's at like 17%. So it would take a lot for it to slip into the second place category. But I think we are going to continue to see it decline, and my guess is that it will end up leveling off for good somewhere around 25% of all giving and stay there, and then we might see it bounce between 24 and 26 and hobble along there. But I don't really see that it's going to rebound. The trend line there is pretty dramatic. The biggest drop off was right there in the late 90s, and then it has sort of settled. But there's no, but it is continuing. Even if we start back and we look at 1997 to now, we've still lost 10 percentage points almost off of it in that time frame. So, it did take a precipitous drop, there in the late 1990s, but it has done nothing to recover from that, and has been continuing to decline. And I expect that it will continue to decline. The interesting thing, there's another slide that we don't have up here for you to see, but if you look at the chart of just dollars given into religion, that chart shows growth. So more dollars are being given to religious causes year over year, but it's not growing at anywhere close to the rate of total giving. So that's where you see this decline. But if you go back and chart that and you inflation adjust that giving to religion, it's almost flat. So not only is it not growing as fast as overall giving is growing, it's just barely growing faster than inflation, which means even though it's growing in dollars, the purchasing power of those dollars for religious organizations has been fairly flat for about 20 years. So more money, but you can't buy more widgets with it because it's just barely keeping up with inflation.
Great. We have another question asking your advice as to the best way to inform donors about advised funds and bundling. Do you have any ideas as to what the best way is to notify your funders that these are giving options?
I think what you want, I think there probably many donors are getting that advice from other sources. Primarily accounting firms seem to be pushing it. But I think what we're encouraging our clients to do is not necessarily to promote bundling, because but to make their constituents aware that if you are thinking of bundling, we're prepared to deal with it. We're thinking of bundling your gift this year. We know we've got a plan in place. We know how to handle it. We're happy to talk to you about it. We'd love to have it. But let people know that you're aware of it, that you have a system in place for managing it, and that you'd love to talk to them about it if they're considering bundling their gifts. Now, you may get some people who get back to you and say, "But I don't know what you're talking about. What's bundling?" And then you can explain it to them. And you may get some calls from people who said, "I was planning on bundling. I'm glad to know you're ready. What's the best way to go about this?" But I think it's, to me, it's as you think about your year-end fundraising appeals and how you're going to handle it, you might think about something that's informational, that just says, "Hey, thinking about bundling, we've got you covered here," and let people know that you are in a position to accept bundled gifts and you're ready to do so. You can also try to promote it, but it's an interesting dynamic with the gift bundling, because in order to be able to bundle your gifts, you have to have enough cash on hand to bundle. So if I'm $1,000 a year donor, I'll use that example again. I'm $1,000 a year donor every year. Do I have an extra $4,000 sitting around to be able to make a $5,000 gift? Am I even capable of bundling? So it's, there's a sort of financial demographic where bundling makes sense, and then there's another financial demographic where bundling doesn't make any sense, because they probably aren't, either they aren't going to get above the standard deduction anyway, or they don't have the cash on hand to bundle. And then at the top end of the donor pyramid, you've got people who are giving away enough money that they're surpassing the standard deduction anyway, so they're going to continue to give as they always have. So I think the thing to do is just create awareness that you're ready to accept bundled gifts, and you have a policy. Most organizations that I work with that are not community foundations or don't have their own donor advised fund structure are not trying to encourage their donors to put money into donor advised funds, because it's, they'd rather have the money come to them directly than go through the donor advised fund.
Well, I don't see any more. Just 2 questions for you. So you must have been very thorough.
Either that, or I was so bad that nobody can formulate a question because they're completely confused now.
I doubt that. But thank you, everybody, for coming. Dave, thank you for joining us today, and I hope everybody has a great rest of their week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye.